Normally, I give myself a lot of time to build a costume for a convention, but this year, I didn't really have any plans for a new costume, because I was so busy trying to catch up on my backlog of videos for this channel. I was asked if I wanted to help out with a cosplay repair table at our local convention, and it sounded like a lot of fun, so I was all for it. But the more we talked about the con, the more excited I got, and the more motivated I became to make something new. I only had a month until the convention, so I didn't have time to go all out and make something extravagant. A casual cosplay was in order. Something I could wear at the cosplay repair table to draw on people for conversations about crafting, but also something I could put on and take off easily when it came time to helping cosplayers in need. I've been playing a lot of Cyberpunk 2077 in my free time, and something about the Maelstrom gang, it struck a nostalgic chord. Their glowing red eyes, for some reason, reminded me of something from my childhood. The Terminator, Terminator 2, especially their promotional material, always focusing on that red glowing eye. I just had to make it. I had to become Maelstrom. I only had about 4 weeks to build this cosplay, so I figured I'd start with the hardest part first, the most recognizable part of any Maelstrom, the face. Coincidentally, this portion's also a part of the gang's initiation ritual. Hi, I'm here for my 10 o'clock.
In the back.
That first step, strip yourself of any humanity, your identity, and embrace the chrome. So, let's get built. Hit me, Doc. For the base, I started with a plastic Halloween skull mask. This came with its own setbacks, as it would increase the overall size of my head. To cut that back some, I removed the inside padding to get the mask a little more snug to my face. I wanted to use the skull mask because it would allow me to have a recessed portion for the cybernetics inside, where the faceplate would be removed. Plus, it would make taking it off and on a lot easier. I'll eventually cut open that spot in the mask, but first I need to mock up a mounting surface for those recessed cybernetics. I did this by just mocking up a simple paper template, molded to the shape of my face. That's of course when Sable lets me use the paper. It didn't need to be perfect, and I didn't mind having any sharp edges to this, as this wouldn't really be seen in the final product. And yes, I got myself with a marker. But with the template made, I marked some alignment marks and made note of all my angle cuts. And with all that good, came time to rip the template apart and transfer everything to EVA foam. I used 3mm foam for this, mostly just to reduce the bulk for the overall mask. And with everything cut out, I gave it all a coat of contact cement. And pressed it all together. For my first test fit, there were several adjustments to make. For starters, there was a nice gap under my eyes. That was an easy fix. Next was the nose. It was a bit too wide, so I ripped it out and started that over. And made a new version that was a little more tight to my actual nose. It looked good enough for now, so time to move on. Next came time to rip open the skull. I started with a cutoff wheel on my Dremel to make the initial cut. But once I gave everything a test fit, I noticed that the skull still stuck out from my face too far. The cheekbones stuck out really far, and the upper teeth hung down really low. So to remedy that, I used some wire snips and cut that portion of the mask free. And used some hot glue to reposition it to a better location. End result was a lot tighter. The corners of the jaw still stuck out too, so I marked those out and removed them as well. Now we're looking better. And now for the fun part, the cybernetics. This was all freehanded as well, with another paper template. My inspiration for this portion was one of the faceplates we see in-game, on characters like Brick, or other random Maelstrom NPCs. It includes 2 lenses in the top corners, 1 in the center, and a pair where the eyes would normally be. My line of sight then won't be through the lenses, but in the small gaps in between the cybernetic eyes. The center lens looks like it's mounted on some kind of a hinge mechanism, which I'm mocking up here. I transferred that to EVA foam, cut that all out, and glued it all together. Once I had it mounted where I wanted, I then used these red gems to figure out how big the lenses would be. These red gems will make up the lenses themselves. I cut out a spot for the lenses and made a small trim for it as well. Here's a quick little preview of how the LEDs will light up the lenses. I was happy with how that was going to look, so I glued the gems in with some hot glue. Next came the lenses in the top corners. While I had the front mocked up, I did not yet make the sides. I guess I should have made these a little more simple, as this had a ton of pieces, which is going to require a ton of angle cuts that go every which way. But somehow, in the transfer, I don't think I messed up any of the angles. So I glued it all together, and cut out the holes for the lenses. And with some contact cement on the face and the lenses, I let them all dry and press them in place. With those on, I moved on to the final set of eyes mocking them up with a paper template too. Same steps as before on these, cleaning up the lens hole and gluing the lens in. And then pressing them onto the face. Looking kinda cool. Up next was the visor. Visually this doesn't seem to make any sense, as in the game it doesn't look like it covers out the cutout section on the face. Plus, with all the cybernetics sticking out, it wouldn't close anyway. But it does look cool, so we're making it. The base shape will be 3 pieces of foam. The middle piece will allow the visor to have a 45-degree bend on both sides from the center. I cut the base pieces out of 10mm foam. I also made an elevated portion for the nose, as the center has a bump to it. The details on top took a couple tries to draw out, to include everything and make it fit. I transferred this to 5mm foam and glued it to the visor. Up next was the mouth. I needed something to cover my mouth since the jaw on this mask is articulated. So for now, I just made a mouth cover while I brainstormed what kind of cybernetics could be hidden inside of the mouth. With that set aside, I chose to make the jaw mechanical. My thought process was that since this mask is movable, any kind of separation at the cheeks would make it look fake. Thankfully, there's plenty of characters in-game with artificial jaws to draw reference from, like Atom Smasher, for example. With that mocked up, I went back to working on the internal cybernetics, starting with attaching the mouth cover to the facial cybernetics. I added some additional bits around the cybernetic eyes to kinda hide the gap between the base mask and the skull mask, making that form of mechanical bits underneath even more confusing. The less human, the better. And then back to the jaw. This will glue directly onto the plastic jaw of the mask later. Like everything else, I transferred this to 3mm EVA foam, cut it out, and glued it all together. Up next, I needed to make mounting hardware for the visor. I used 5mm foam for this. I traced it out on a roll of tape for the shape, cut that out, and then cut it in half. And with some more foam, I cut out some of the little doodads for the mounting hardware where it attaches to the face. Glued all that together. Once I glued those then to the internal cybernetics, I was then able to mock up and figure out the angle that the visor would rest at. The lower I needed it to rest, the more I cut off from the hinge. I wasn't gluing this to the visor yet though, not until later when the internal cybernetics gets glued to the inside of the skull mask. It just makes taking everything apart for now a whole lot easier. And then I went back to the inside of the mouth. I thought it'd be fun to have a lens inside the mouth too, so I mocked that up, along with some wires and tube things that went into that, using some dowels that I split down the center. At some point, I had also trimmed the jaw, removing the teeth, and trimming the sides more, so that nothing would stick out past the mechanical jaw. Speaking of which, with some contact cement, I glued the jaw on as well. It's starting to come together. Here what I'm doing is using some scrap foam to try and fill in the gaps between the cheeks of the bone and the front part of the mouth. I don't want this portion to be completely sunken in when I go to mock up the skin, which is coming up next. This started with a basic duct tape template. I started by wrapping the mask in duct tape where I wanted the skin to be and mark the edges with a marker. For the back half of the head, I did the same, this time wrapping my head in plastic wrap first, followed by duct tape. Once I had what I wanted, I then grabbed the front half of the mask and started working on putting them together. I started by cutting off the excess that I didn't need, and then taped the front and back together. Using some various references from the game, I then started figuring out where my divider lines would be on the head. I then cut all those pieces free and began transferring them all to foam. My idea was that the front and top would be one piece, and the back and sides would separate. This would help with taking the mask off and on, but it would also help with heat by giving it somewhere to escape. And with a ton of contact cement, I glued the front portion to the skull, starting with the forehead and unwrapping the piece around the temple and cheeks until it met together at the upper lip. After doing the sides of the head, I then went and trimmed the top portion of the template to make another layer. I really liked this mechanical Mohawk that some of the characters had, and thought it would be fun to make. The second pass will be the base plate for those metal Mohawk spikes. I used 5mm for this, to give it a noticeable elevation. And then I got to work on the back portion of the head. A lot of these guys have cybernetics hanging out of the back of their skull, and I wanted this too. So I made a recessed portion for the back of the head to mount all those bits and wires to. And with all that made, I glued it inside. And from this point, I think I was going to work, so I did a quick first pass with foam clay, since I wasn't going to be able to touch this for a few days anyway. My main goal was just to get any elevated parts from any scar tissue, like around the opening of the face, and I built up a little bit of foundation for the lips. Something like the lips would require 2 passes, just because if I were to do it all in one go, it would sag and droop as it dried. While sharing my progress shots, someone made a Ninja Turtles joke about his upper lip, specifically Donatello with his goggles and that nerdy squint. I saw it too, and it was partially intentional. The extra skin over the corners of the mouth was just excess until I could determine how much to trim and clean up. And the buck teeth was really just there because I still needed to do a second pass of the foam clay. But I got it all cleaned up and ready for more work. Next came the rear cybernetics. I'd already built the recession in the back of the head, so my next step was to make a template for the actual mechanism that would fit inside. I started with the base outline of the design, making sure it fit snug inside the opening. And from there, I started adding paper to figure out the shape that I needed. This probably would have been easier if I had proper references at the time. The screenshots I had for both the back and front of the head were all taken in-game, but not in photo mode. I honestly didn't start really playing with photo mode until I started making this video, where I now get to see all the tiny little details I got wrong. Hindsight's fun. But anyway, I only really built half of the back because I could just flip the template when I'm done. Speaking of which, looks like this thing's finally ready to be transferred to foam. Just like before, I made additional alignment marks, numbered my pieces, and even took a photo with my phone to make sure I knew where everything was and what angle cuts to use. And I transferred that all to foam and started cutting. These pieces were so tiny that when it came to contact cement, I used my X-Acto knife to hold them. I knew that with them being so small, that my fingers would just get coated real quick, and that would get pieces stuck to me, and then to each other, and by then everything would just be all over the place on the table. Because if you've ever used contact cement, you know how those invisible tiny strings of glue will just gravitate towards each other, and the next thing you know, everything's just floating together. It becomes a mess. But I managed to get it all glued and put together without any problems. Somehow. And finally, a little bit of cleanup with my Dremel. Then I made sure that it fit properly inside of the back of the head, by marking and removing any material that would prevent it from fitting in nice and snug. And with a little bit of contact cement, I pressed it all in. Up next were the wires. The tubes sticking out of the back of these guys' heads were pretty big in diameter, so using a foam dowel would be great. I cut them to the length, and then used some 3mm foam for trim on the ends. To make sure these would stay well, I cut a hole where the dowel would go so that they would fit inside, and I put the trim back just a little bit. In theory, this would give a stronger bond, as it'll grab on both the inside and the outside of the surface. I also felt like the two large tubes wasn't enough, so I made a few smaller ones as well by cutting some 5mm foam strips and sanding the edges smooth. I gave their ends some trim as well for extra hold. No fancy mounting techniques here, just because these were so thin in comparison to the larger dowels. But anyway, with some contact cement, I put them on too. Up next were the LEDs for the lenses, so we could get that really cool red glow. I started by cutting out the back of the mask, where every lens was. I'll be recovering this in the end, but right now, I just need access to the inside so I can work. I also had to completely remove the center eye to do this. I needed to rework this piece, because having LEDs behind it, I needed some kind of housing to properly illuminate the lens. And it was a lot easier to work on while it was off. It was also helpful because it gave me the opportunity to brainstorm ideas on how to diffuse the lighting inside. I wanted the lenses to glow, but I didn't want to show off the individual glow of my LEDs. So I came up with this idea to have a reflector in the back. I had considered buying some reflector tape at the store, but I already had some red plastic, so I figured some white paper behind the red plastic would help catch and bounce that red light inside. With that all glued together, it came time to figure out the mess I was dealing with these lights. I chose these tiny party lights because they didn't require much power to run. 2 watch batteries was all it needed, which meant hiding these batteries in the mask would be really easy. I just had to figure out a path for these LEDs, where to put them, and how to divide them up amongst the lenses. I can't remember the exact number, but they did all roughly have about the same amount. I started with the center eye first, at the end of the line. That way I could work with the LEDs while still having the nose off, making it easier to handle. Both the nose put all back together, time to finish the rest. The inside of the mask was a little harder to show. I more or less wrapped a few LEDs into a circle and wrapped them around the edge of the lens. To mock up the shape of the opening, I just used some painter's tape and a marker. I then transferred this to paper to fine-tune. This worked out in my favor because I could then use the paper as a backing for the red plastic, but it also worked as a template for my EVA foam that I needed to cut. And that one strip made up the top 3 lenses. Now onto the bottom 3. Same thing as before, I counted out my LEDs, divided them up amongst the 3, rolled my LEDs into a circle, to be glued around the rim of the lens. One thing I didn't record was the housing for the batteries themselves. They both fit snug into a little pouch that I made in the top of the head. I could pull them out, turn them off and on, change batteries, and then put them back in without any worries about them being affected by any of my head sweat. But anyway, LEDs are all done. Still a little bit of cleanup to do, as you can see some light coming out of some of the corners here and there. That'll all be taken care of later. Up next was the metal Mohawk. The base plate was already on, and thanks to the cut lines, I kind of had some clear markers for where these could go. I didn't know exactly how many I needed yet, so I decided just to make a bunch. I used some more foam dowels and cut them into 3-inch chunks. And using a long utility knife, I sliced them all to a point. To make them like the metal spikes in game, there was also a small notch carved close to the base. I marked those out and did my best to etch them out with 2 opposing angle cuts. This didn't always work, leading to me ripping a few pieces apart, but that's why I made more. Once I had a decent batch made, I sanded the spikes smooth, and then started figuring out my placement, using some painter's tape and a marker. Once I figured out where I wanted them, I then marked the head for some contact cement. I then got to work on the smaller spikes. Using the same foam dowels, I cut them into 1-inch chunks and repeated that process again. After sanding them all smooth, I reused my pieces of painter's tape to figure out where I wanted these to be, which was offset in between the center spikes. And with those all ready too, came the contact cement again. And finally, we get to glue them all on. I'd been holding off on the sides of the head for a while because I still wasn't 100% sure on what I wanted to do with them. Keep in mind, I've been winging this thing the whole project. At first, I wasn't planning on making ears at all and was thinking of just making them mechanical, mostly because I thought ears would be too time consuming. But I figured since we got more than enough borged out parts, I should just do some ears so it looks like he was at least once human. I started with a template traced out from my own ear. And to capture the depth, I'll be building these ears up in layers. I just kept cutting the template a little more and more for each layer. With everything together, then I needed to figure out their mounting angle. I didn't want them laying flat on the head, they needed to stick out just a little bit. I used my utility knife to cut the mounting angle, and once I had what I wanted, I cut out the excess skin on the side of the head so that nothing was blocking my actual ears so I could hear properly. And the final thing to build, which I'm still not sure if I like or not, was a strip of skin on the chin. My thought process was that I needed the mechanical jaw to explain the moving parts, but I was worried about how the mouth would look after paint. So, for better or worse, I made this piece for the chin. And with some context cement, on it went. I think my worry in hindsight was that everything I added would bulk the face up more, making the head bigger with every addition. And finally, the last stage of foam clay to tie this all together. I wedged a roll of tape inside the jaw so that it would stay open. My worry was that if the mouth was to close, as the clay dried, the foam would expand and move a little bit, meaning that if the lips touched each other, then they'd dry together, so this helped prevent that. This is probably my third time making lips with clay, and I finally started figuring out my technique for this. I stretched it out smooth across the line of the lip first until everything was smoothed out in every direction, and then I pressed the edge flat up against the face. The end result looks pretty good. And from there, I moved on to the rest of the head. I worked on the cheekbones a bit to make them just a little bit more defined so that they'd flow to the ears just a little better. And speaking of ears, I hit them up too, to kind of smooth out the layers of foam that made up their shape. And with that, there was nothing else left to add. I just had to let it sit for a few days while the clay dried. I don't feel any different. Well, just another day in Night City, I guess. Well, at least I made my mask. This portion took up the majority of the build time by probably about 2 weeks. I did this hard part first so I could gauge out how much time I had left in the project. I could then allocate that time to the rest of the pieces for the build, what kind of cybernetics I wanted to add, plus whatever else would make out the silhouette for a Maelstrom. But with that, the mask is done. We got 2 weeks left in the project. Next episode, we'll be covering the Mantis Blades. See you in the next one.